following program is classified G. It's suitable for all ages.
Tonight, is Sri Lankan law guaranteeing an equal playing field in sports? Are there legal barriers which we are not aware of? Sporting has been part of the lifeblood within Sri Lanka for quite some time. A key highlight within the sporting industry in Sri Lanka was the ICC World Cup win of 1996, where all Sri Lankans were brought together to celebrate the victory of Sri Lanka, solidifying its presence in the cricket field. This has been followed by a variety of wins in many fields in regional and international levels. But have we gone far enough in terms of the annual investments put into sports? How should the law transform to cater to the new competitive requirements of the 21st century? Welcome to Law, Land and Liberty. We are keeping with the promise of bringing to you a contemporary legal topic and breaking it down in the midst of a guest. And today we selected the topic of sports law within this country. A topic that has quite a few grey areas, and we're going to really build on it, really break it down and understand what it is. And we have with us a very special guest who I will give you the portfolio of, and then I'll introduce to you who the person is. He's a member of the Special Experts Committee appointed by the President of the country to draft a new constitution. He's a member of the Sri Lanka Law Commission and the Incorporated Council of Legal Education. He also heads the subcommittee tasked with the digitization and court automation of the entire legal judicial system within the country, and is also part of the committee appointed by the Sports Ministry, which is in charge of amending the sports law within this country. President's Counsel, Navin Marapana. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
All right. In keeping with how we conduct the discussion within this program, we are going to talk about four key areas. Firstly, we are going to talk about the legal provisions for sports within Sri Lanka. Next, the laws against fraud in sports within this country. Next, about the international regulations that are present and how it will affect the domestic law. And finally, the reformation of sports law in the future.
Hello, my name is Marapana and I'm a science student. My question is about the legal provisions for sports in Sri Lanka. What are the legal provisions for sports in Sri Lanka?
All right, let's go into the first segment about the legal provisions for sports within the country. As I am aware, Mr. Marapana, the mother of all of these regulations would be the sports law, number 25 of 1973. And the rest of it trickles down from that point onwards. Give us an introduction, a basic breakdown as to how we approach the topic, this vast topic of sports law within Sri Lanka.
Well, actually, it's not as vast as we would think. It's just been complicated by various regulations that have come into, being over a period of time. As you quite rightly said, the mother law is the sports law of 1973. Now, this is going on. It's almost 50 years old. Under the sports law, the Minister of Sports, over a period of time, various ministers have passed various regulations. So to get a complete picture of the sporting legal umbrella, so to speak, you have to try to make sense of the main law as well as all the various bits and pieces of regulation that have accumulated over a period of time. Now, collating all of this is a bit of a task. But you're right when you say the sports law is the main law. There are regulations under it. And in addition, in the field of sport, there are two other laws that have come recently. That is the Convention Against Doping in Sports that came in 2013, Act number 33, as well as the Prevention of Offences Relating to Sports, which is a more recent act in 2019. So it's these three pieces of legislation that basically set out the legal framework for the governance of sports in Sri Lanka.
All right, so it brings up the question of, okay, now where does the differentiation between professional and non-professional sports arise? Now, does that sort of, because I know you have been creating a lot of awareness pertaining to how the commercial aspects are involved with sports within this country, and we should cater to that. And we'll talk a bit more about this in detail when we go to our last segment. But I want to understand, sir, how does this classification between, okay, a national level sport, a sporting individual who is professionally pursuing a career, are they protected separately under separate legislation? Or how does that work?
That's actually a very good question and a very timely question. In 1973, when this law came into being, the sporting environment was very different to what it is today, especially in Sri Lanka. Sports was done on an amateur basis. There were no people who earned a living out of the sports, apart from the coaches. It was mainly a pastime which was taken to international level. So, and at that time, the entirety of sports are regulated by the various associations and the government funded everything. So there were pretty much three stakeholders in it. One is the government, one was a sporting association for the various sports, and the third was the individuals who took part in the sports. Now, since 1973, this act has been amended thrice in 93, 98 and 2005. But those are very minor cosmetic amendments. The current sporting environment that we find ourselves today, even in Sri Lanka, is vastly different. I mean, sports is now considered a profession by some people. Parents actively sometimes tell children to take up sport, which was unheard of in 1973. So, the most important thing, in 1973, there was virtually no private sector participation in sports in the form of commercial sponsorships. So in today's environment, you have professional athletes and professional sportsmen. You have commercial leagues that have sprung up, which are domestic leagues, which are run commercially. Plus you have the private sector actively taking part in the sporting sphere. Now, the question that emerges is, does this archaic piece of legislation, which is almost 50 years old, match up to today's sporting realities? And the simple answer to that is no. And it is because of the inadequacies of this act that the present sports minister, who is a sportsman himself and who knows what it's about, has set up a committee to amend the law to bring it in line with today's realities. So as to answer your question, a professional athlete who is professionally sponsored by a private entity, also intent on making money out of that athlete, they are not adequately protected by this act. And the commercial arrangements that they enter into are not adequately protected. Right. So that is an area which we will need to reform and which has to be urgently done if Sri Lanka is to go to the next level in the sporting world.
True. A very important area there, and it's great that the current authorities are really looking into it. My next question, President's Counsel, is going to be on now, within the Act itself, since we are speaking to laymen, we don't have to get too technical pertaining to this. But what are the key areas you believe maybe are the positives, maybe things that we have recognized over a certain period of time and things we can develop on as we move ahead? Because number of other areas that we need to touch on is things like how fraud is managed here, how internationally how this is dealt with. But when it comes to local legislature, does every different sport have a separate way of addressing it, or is there some overarching way in which we can, address, okay, look, this is the way, this is the sort of blueprint that we have to follow in terms of getting other acts across, in terms of getting other organizations together for sports? Just if you could shed some light on that aspect.
Well, the issue is this. There is under the sports law, there are various regulations passed on how sporting associations have to conduct their affairs. In addition to that, each individual association has its own constitution. So our regulations say you can have your own constitution, but it has to be in line with relevant regulations under the sports law. And if there is a conflict, the regulations under the sports law will prevail. So now the issue is whether having this situation, you can't blame the act in its entirety, because this sports law, while it is in place, we have won 2 Cricket World Cups. We have got an Olympic silver medal. We have done well in the international arena in various sports. So it is not I wouldn't insult this piece of legislation by saying it's a failure. It is not a failure. And there are a lot of positives that we can take from it, such as the creation of a sports council, the various departments, and the National Olympic Committee and so on. But it is time to change that, because there is actually nothing much you can build up on it what it needs is a complete makeover. It has to come, be revamped and relaunched as something that will fit today's needs and wants of the sporting world. So to answer your question, there is actually, we can take the experiences we have gained from this act. We can look at all the constitutions in other countries that sporting bodies use and whatever, and formulate a far more structured and, dare I say, more modern, forward-thinking piece of legislation.
Okay, a very good introduction, I should say, President's Counsel. But one last aspect that I want to touch on is, what are the other parts or the other bodies that have been empowered by this specific legislation? Now, I think you touched on something very important about the National Sports Council, and let's really dwell into that and talk about the mandate of the council. Prior to that, now we see there are certain sports that take upper hand. We see cricket that has been spoken of. We see other sports that's like that has more presence within schooling and whatnot. My next question is, what are these other authorities, so other bodies that have been empowered through the sports legislation, as in the sports law within the country?
Currently, the main body, there is a sports council, but as you know, the sports council is a main advisory council to the Honourable Minister. But under this act, the sports council is only given a advisory role. They can't be more proactive. And as you know, if you look at the personalities who are in the current sports council, I mean, we have a fantastic star-studded sports council. And we have some extremely competent former sports persons from the corporate sector, from the administrative sector, but they can't do much in terms of this act. But apart from advise the minister. So in addition, there is a setting up of various departments. Then there is a National Association of Sports Coaches, established of the National Olympic Committee. This act has set up various bodies, but it has not given them the power apart from a very limited role. Then in addition, we have the Sri Lanka Anti-Doping Agency that is also creature of statute, and also the special unit set up under the prevention of offences relating to sports. That's a special police unit that is, I think, based out of the Sugathadasa Stadium, that is specially set up under the sports legislation that is currently there, to do inquire into various acts of match fixing or corruption. So those are the primary bodies that are set up under this act. And I think the most important of it, the two most important are the National Olympic Committee and the National Sports Council.
All right.
So these two are the actual, the most important entities that are there in the present setup.
Okay, I think that really gives us a good picture about what we are talking about and where we need to go ahead with this. A few other things that I need to explore with you, President's Counsel Navin Marapana. But before that, let's take a very short break and you will join us back on Law, Land and Debate.
My name is Vinuka Rajapaksa and I am a mathematics student. My question is about the laws against fraud in sport. How are fraudulent activities in sports governed?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in conversation with President's Counsel Navin Marapana. Sir, our first segment we really touched on what exactly is the fundamental legislation present within this country, and there are a few steps and few other things that we need to explore pertaining to the umbrella organizations that are formed through it. Now my question then falls onto the general point that many people think that the sports law is about is generally just about things like cheating, things like fraud, things like doping, multiple avenues of how sports can be conducted in a fair and equal manner. Now, I believe that when it comes to separate sports, this differs. My first question is going to be, Mr. Marapana, what are the cross-cutting sort of legislature that is present to talk about these aspects of cheating. Now that you gave a proper insight as to how important sports is to the men and women within this country, and they have really taken that up. We are very serious about the sporting within this country. So a serious sort of effort takes a serious, let's say, tone, a serious legislative framework that will govern it. What are these aspects that are present, sir?
Actually, when it comes to sports, there are two main issues. One is doping, and the other one is match fixing. We have two pieces of legislation that deal with both. There is an act in 2013 pertaining to doping, and there is another act in 2019 which deals with offences of match fixing, tournament fixing, corruption in sport, manipulation, so on and so forth. Now, the biggest issue, as sport gets more lucrative and where there is more prize money, more fame, more fortune, the propensity for an athlete to cheat is very high. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and Sri Lanka has not been immune to it. Even in our small way, we have a lot of doping related issues. So now there is a Sri Lanka anti-doping agency, and that is an authority empowered with investigating and penalizing people who are charged with doping offences. And it also plays a very vital role in educating athletes, because in my experience, what I have come across is sometimes the athlete is not the person who's initially tempted with this to dope or to take performance enhancing drugs. Sometimes the coaches play a big role, because in between the coaches there's a lot of competition. So by educating athletes and by being very hard on people who have been found to have taken involved in doping, I think Sri Lanka has been successful to a large extent in reducing it. But every year you hear of some high-profile athlete or cricketer or rugby player or someone who's involved in some kind of a doping-related issue. And even in schools, especially in schools rugby, there are various allegations that there is a bit of doping going on. So there is legislation to cover it, and there is an agency that is in charge of doing it. And if anyone has a complaint to make, you can make a complaint to the Director General of the agency, and they will generally investigate.
Right.
So we are very strict on that, and it's very structured in Sri Lanka. I think better than most countries in the world. Then when it comes to match fixing, especially in sports like cricket, because cricket has a lot of interest in the Indian subcontinent where they do a lot of betting. There have been allegations of match fixing in the past, and all these things have cumulatively led to the promulgation of an act in 2019, which criminalizes a lot of these offences. And as a result of this act, there is now a special police unit headed by, I think, an SSP, a senior officer, based out of the Subatadasa Stadium to investigate any allegations of match fixing. So if anyone, even a member of the public, gets to know something, they can make a complaint to the Director General or the Secretary of the Ministry or contact this unit directly, and they will investigate matters. So Sri Lanka has actually, to its credit, taken both these issues of doping and match fixing very seriously, and we have very comprehensive legislation in place to deal with it. So I think in that department, I don't think we need to do any further amendments or whatever. All the law is in place, and I think there is the political will also to enforce these laws.
President's Counsel, something that we want to clarify in the offset is, now when it comes to things like complaints, now you did mention that there was an authority, but what aspect does the police play in this? What are the other relevant institutions that you go to in terms of investigations? Is it just that for match fixing there is a separate organization or separate authority that we go to? What about the other offences? When maybe even to a national level or school level, can those things be contested if a participant or an athlete or a coach even is not okay with the decision within a national competition? How can that be contested if it's possible?
It is possible. Well, there are two aspects to that question. Let's separate the doping and the match fixing and corruption part separately. Let's say you make a complaint about doping. If you make a false complaint, they can find fault with you. The other is very easy. If you're jealous about somebody, or you can just make to malign somebody.
Yeah.
But if it's a legitimate complaint and there's an investigation and they test the athlete and it is found that the athlete has tested positive, the athlete has various, because there are about 2 appeals that the athlete can do within the act itself. So these are world structures. I mean, these are the practices followed in very developed countries as well. So if there's an allegation against you and it has not been proved, you will be discharged. I mean, every day there is a committee. There are committees under the Convention Against Doping Act, appeals committees. That's it. Sometimes athlete has tested positive. The first appeal has also been found against athlete, but then the final appeal they hold with the athlete. So there are structures in place, and there is no situation where somebody who's innocent will not get a fair chance to clear their name. So that's when it comes to doping. In the same way, the match fixing, tournament fixing, and corruption, those are criminal offences which carry jail time.
Okay.
So the investigative standards are very high. And a person charged with those offences has all the appealable procedures under law in Sri Lanka to clear their name. So in both these instances, there are structures in place, and the structures are actually accepted worldwide, and they are pretty world-class structures. So there is no an athlete or a person at the receiving end of a complaint is not without recourse.
Okay.
I think that answers your question.
I think that really clarifies a few things. Something I want to continue on within that same line is President's Counsel pertaining to this this authority issue. Now, where does an individual go in terms of when there is a complaint, and does the courts get involved at any point? Because if it is a private entity, we see that even when it comes to labor laws or when it comes to any other form of arbitration, at one point you can go to the courts and question a certain decision also. Is that involved at any point, whether at the Court of Appeals or even to the Supreme Court? Where does that, where do they coincide, the arbitration aspect of this and the courts?
Well, in the case of doping, the appeal structure is set out in the Act, and it is to various appeal committees. But at the end of the day, if the final appeal committee acts against you, the athlete may have, I mean, these are debatable questions, may have a right to go to the Court of Appeal in the form of a writ application to challenge that decision. I don't think that has happened yet, but that possibility is there. But in the case of match fixing and corruption, those are normal criminal offences. So then the courts of Sri Lanka take control of those things, and you will have the normal appeal processes that are available to anybody. So the appellate structure is slightly different in the two, but it is there, and an individual who faces an inquiry, I mean, if they say I'm an athlete and somebody raises a complaint against me, I will not be punished arbitrarily. There are structures where I can present my side of the story, and somebody will take a decision. Then if I'm not satisfied, there are methods of appealing that decision. That is all in the statute book.
Okay. As a final question within this segment, something I want to ask you, President's Counsel, is pertaining to the aspects of fraud. Now, in collecting things like evidence, or in collecting things like, when it comes to general criminal offences, it's far more straightforward than when it comes to sports. Just touch on that, the elements of offences that happen and how that acquisition part happens for investigations. And if possible, if you could talk to us a bit more about how these authorities function. Now, you did mention that there is someone specific when it comes to match fixing. And that aspect is in fact governed. But on more, let's say, on more micro levels, if there are issues between competitors, if there are issues between decisions of sort, is that not something that can be remedied at a court level, but should be the final decision of whoever is adjudicating those specific competitions?
Well, the issue is this: if you look at collection of evidence is concerned, especially when it comes to match fixing and doping, it is mainly electronic evidence. Even, let's say, if you take part in an international competition, let's say you take part in an ICC Cricket World Cup,
okay,
and the tournament itself will have its own rules and regulations, and they have very high powered anti-corruption units that can, for example, take your phone away from you. Recently one of our cricketers got suspended because he refused to give his phone. So the authorities have a right; they can confiscate your phone, and they have very highly developed software that can extract all the information from it. So whatever you have deleted, even if you have formatted it, you can still extract the data. So even the Prevention of Offences Related to Sports Act in Sri Lanka gives us police units wide-ranging powers to obtain evidence, because in today's digital age, it's very easy to, you delete or you throw a phone away or whatever. Most of the evidence is electronic. So you don't technically need to go to court for that. The Act itself empowers, but there are some instances, if it's under the, for example, match fixing provision, you may need to get an order from a magistrate or whatever to get it. But usually in tournaments, the tournament rules, if it's like a world international tournament, the tournament rules will give the anti-corruption entity or authority in charge of that particular tournament wide-ranging powers to acquire and gather evidence.
All right. I think that really brings us very well to the next subject that we need to talk about international regulations and how it affects domestic sport. Let's talk about that within our next segment. But before that, let's take a look at the legal happenings within this week. Here is Suzanne Shenali with Law in the Land.
Thank you, Danidhu. Let's take a look as to how the law has worked in our land. The Registrar of the Supreme Court issued new guidelines of what kind of cases will be prioritized to be heard during the quarantine curfew time period. The guidelines were issued last week. Parties willing to have their cases heard digitally can make a motion with that regard to the Registrar. Moreover, litigants will not be permitted to enter the Superior Court's complex unless permission has been obtained from the relevant presiding judge. A 3-member advisory board has been appointed to overlook the judicial process of those in jail or under detention orders for their involvement in terrorist attacks. The President's Media Division said the advisory board, which has been appointed under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, will be headed by former Chief Justice Ashoka De Silva. The board has been tasked with analysing and recommending to the President the release or granting of bail of those in jail or under detention orders for their involvement in terrorist activities. A new animal protection law in Sri Lanka will mandate that captive elephants receive their own biometric ID cards and that riders of the animal aren't permitted to drink on the job. Aside from strict regulations around working elephants, the new measures mandate requires a daily 2.5-hour bath for each animal. Violations of the new law can result in an elephant being placed in state of care and a prison sentence of 3 years of the owner. That was a look at the major events of how the law has worked in our land. We will now go into a short commercial break. Danindra will be back after the break.
Student. My question is about the international regulations. What are the international regulations governing sports?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in conversation with President's Counsel, Navin Marapana, and we are in our third segment where we're going to talk a bit about these international regulations and how exactly they influence the functioning of sports within a country, because that inherently is important. With sports, there is a domestic element to it, but the more the recognition is provided when it goes to an international tier, and there are the legal questions arise as to who makes the final call. Is it someone international, and are we bound to follow it, or can we contest that within legislature within this country as well? Mr. Marapana, now a lot of grey areas there, I should say, in terms of who arbitrates and who gets to make the final call. How do you exactly witness as as a starting point, how do you see the international arbitration systems? Maybe when it comes to the courts that speak about, or the international courts that speak about international sportsmen and women, and when it comes to their judgments or their the way they govern it, and how we should implement that within this country. How is that connection made?
Well, it is a big grey area, because I'll give an example. We have Sri Lanka Cricket. Sri Lanka Cricket is the association that governs cricket in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka Cricket domestically in Sri Lanka is governed by the provision of the sports law and the regulations thereafter. Then on an international level, there are two international bodies that have governance over Sri Lanka cricket. One is the Asian Cricket Council, to a lesser extent, and to a larger extent, it's the International Cricket Council. So it's like a child torn between two parents. You have the sports ministry powers under the sports law, and the responsibilities and obligations under the International Cricket Council. Now, let's say one of our cricketers goes and plays in the World Cup, and he does something violative of the tournament rules of the World Cup. So then that is an ICC tournament. The local laws don't apply to it. The ICC will have an inquiry, and they will impose a punishment on the player. They'll tell the player, you can't play international cricket, you can't play domestic cricket, and you have to give a fine of so much. Now, when that cricketer comes to Sri Lanka, he plays a domestic match. And when Sri Lanka cricket tries to stop him, he goes to the courts of law in Sri Lanka and says, there is nothing, I have not done anything wrong under our laws. I have not broken any law, therefore you can't stop me. And he is quite correct. What happens in such a situation? So here you have Sri Lanka cricket now torn between two entities. Under the local laws and the sports law and whatever, the cricketer has not done anything wrong, but the ICC has said he has done something wrong and he should be banned. Now, if the Sri Lanka cricket does not ban that cricketer, in Sri Lanka they have not done anything wrong.
True.
But what happens always is the international body will pass sanctions on Sri Lanka cricket. They will tell Sri Lanka cricket, we gave you a directive, you did not listen to it, therefore we are not allowing you to play any international cricket under the ICC rules until you sort yourself out. Now, if you look at the Olympics this year, Russia didn't compete as Russia. The Russian athletes competed as a Russian Olympic Committee. That is because the International Olympic Committee has a fight with the Russian government over doping. And the Russian government did not comply with certain suggestions and requirements. Therefore, they banned Russia from sending athletes to the Olympics. So the athletes had to come under a different name. So there is this perennial dispute between the demands of the international governing bodies as well as domestic demands. And whilst everyone tries to ensure that there is parity between the two, there is almost always not. And it causes friction and it causes trouble worldwide. It's not only in Sri Lanka, but this is a problem that needs to be addressed, but actually cannot be fully addressed.
Okay. A question that comes to my mind as we talk about this, Mr. Marapana, is about now there are international courts that are in charge, I believe, for football. This was quite common when we talk about the FIFA and certain action taken against certain players who sort of misbehaved within certain matches. And we see that form of standpoint then held, that form of standard held against the not only the participants but the people that come to attend and watch the match as well. And if there is a certain clash between the spectators, there is some form of action that is being taken. How valid or how legitimate is action such as that, and are we bound to follow these directives that are being given by the international court or maybe even the international body?
Well, let's separate the two. If it is a decision of an international court, there are laws in Sri Lanka which make some of them applicable and enforceable and some of them are not. Then a decision by an international governing body, let's say for example, Sri Lanka is hosting the Rugby World Cup match in Sri Lanka and there is some spectator issue.
Yeah.
The International Rugby Federation passes sanctions on the Sri Lankan Domestic Rugby Federation saying you did not comply with these things, therefore we are going to punish you. Now, whether the local courts in Sri Lanka are going to accept that punishment or whether that can be enforced is not an issue because they have not breached any local laws. So as far as a decision of a foreign international body being enforced in Sri Lanka, as long as no Sri Lankan law or regulation is breached, they can't do anything. But that's not going to get us anywhere because if we don't comply with it, we will never be able to play international rugby again. The international parent body will tell all the other member countries, don't play with Sri Lanka until they comply. So whilst these decisions of international bodies are not enforceable per se, they can enforce it in far more effective ways by sanctioning the governing body or the country. Okay. So effectively, the short and long of it is, if we want to compete internationally, we have to follow the requirements of the international governing bodies.
Okay. The next question that I would like to clarify with you, President's Counsel, is about whether once an athlete goes to another country. Now, we did talk about now if an athlete comes to Sri Lanka and violates Sri Lankan law, it's quite clear if it's a Sri Lankan, it's quite straightforward. You know, if it's criminal law, you can go ahead and if there's a penalty in charge, that can be held against that individual. But when it comes to the international level, and let's say they are in violation of the law within that country, maybe even outside of the sporting sphere, how will such an individual be held accountable? Even if a foreigner comes to this country to take part in sports, what requirements or how is the law encompassing those individuals and how are they brought under the ambit of the law?
Well, if you go to a foreign country and violate, like let's say if an athlete goes to the Olympics and then is charged with shoplifting while shopping, that the laws of that country will apply and they will be punished. It's as simple as that. And if a foreigner comes to Sri Lanka and then assaults someone on the street, the Sri Lankan normal laws will apply and they'll be punished. So that's not a sports law related issue. That's just a normal basic laws of whatever country. You can't go to another country and break their laws, and their laws will apply. Now, if you break their laws and then come back to Sri Lanka before you're caught or something, then you have to look at whether there are extradition rules or whatever to take you back and be punished. Now, that's not how shall I put it, anything related to sports or sports law. That is whatever the law in that particular country will apply to anybody who's there at a given time.
Okay. In terms of moving forward within the discussions, I want to get your clarification on this. In how we react and how we work with the international community, as you mentioned, has become quite important when it comes to the sports law within a country or how we deal with it internationally. Where do you see, because the next segment we are going to talk about reforms, I want to get a segue to that. Where do we see we should really focus some attention in bridging the gaps? So where are the gaps in terms of us complying to these international standards, to the international regulations? Are there places where we need to build ourselves on? Are there places where there's a huge vacuum in terms of where the law has been built?
Yes, the principal bone of contention that international bodies have with local legislation is the level of political interference in the running of the sport. Now, that's the eternal fight that goes on because international bodies want the local sports bodies virtually autonomous. And they want to limit the amount of political interference that can be brought to bear on the affairs of such bodies. So that is where there is a constant conflict. And each time a regulation is passed under our laws, the international IOC or the various international bodies start complaining. Okay. So that is the level of parity that we need to get. But to do that, if you can't agree with them 100% because the structure of how things run in Sri Lanka, you can't completely do away with regulation by political authority. So whilst you can do away with interference by political authorities, I think in Sri Lanka, especially even in today's context, there has to be a form of structured regulation of our sports bodies because most of them still depend on funding from the Ministry of Sports.
Exactly.
Now it's quite different. If all our sports were running independently, they source their own money, they didn't use taxpayer money, then you can make out a legitimate case that they should get a greater autonomy in running their own affairs. But as long as that doesn't happen, the Ministry of Sports and the government regulators should have a right to regulate them.
True.
I mean, you have to draw a line between interference and regulation. And I feel that what the international bodies want is complete autonomy, which I don't think in the Sri Lankan context we can do, and it should not be given. So I think it's a fine line, but it's a fine line it's a line that has to be there though.
Okay. A very good place where we can really find some segue into our last segment. Thank you for that clarification. So we'll go in for a small break. Stay with us on Law, Land and Liberty.
Hello, my name is Binuri and I'm a science undergraduate. My question is about the reformation of sports law. How will the sports law in Sri Lanka change in the future?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in conversation with President's Counsel Navin Marapana, and this is our last segment, and we're going to talk a bit about the reformation aspect of sports law, given that we have really given a context as to where we are as of now in terms of this country, in terms of where the sports are heading. And I think what was really clear is that we are in a special point where we take sports seriously, where we have taken the ambitions, the aspirations of the general athlete that is taking part in sports very seriously. And as an individual who's part of the committee in charge of amending the sports law, I believe you'll have some really good insight to this. I don't want to constrain you to a single question as we start this segment. Where are the areas that you're currently focusing on?
Well, historically, sports ministers have always wanted to accumulate power. And, they all want to wave a big stick at all the sports associations to control them. But that kind of reality doesn't sit with where sports is today. Luckily, this present sports minister, from the day he took office, took some policy decisions, such as he is totally against interim committees. And he wants to divest as much of his power as possible while retaining only a policy-making role. Now, if one of the main aspects of the new sports law reform is the will of the sports ministry to give more power to the National Sports Council. Because the National Sports Council should do the day-to-day management and the implementation of the policies of the minister. Because there is a very knowledgeable, very talented and experienced sports council currently in place. But sadly, we can't make use of these individuals because their role is circumscribed by the Act. So the one main area of improvement is to empower the sports council. The second aspect of it is to create a framework where private sector involvement as sponsors and as stakeholders is recognized. I mean, we can ask ourselves a question. We have a double World Cup winning Sri Lanka cricket team. We won the 50 overs and we won the T20. Why don't we have world-class brands sponsoring them? Do we have a Rolex or a Mercedes or a Nike or one of those big companies? Why aren't they coming? And the reason is very simple. High-end sponsors want long-term relationships. They are very nervous where the office bearers change every 2 years and their contracts may be at risk. They want to have stability. So within the new act, we must create a framework where you can have a corporate structure to do your contract management and sponsorships. So for example, Sri Lanka Cricket will have elected office bearers to run at a high policy level, but it will have an incorporated body that will sign contracts and that can enter into long-term agreements with private entities. Unless and until you give them that comfort of stability and that contract management is given a structured place in the legal framework, we will not get the big private sector money coming into our sports. The third aspect of it is we have to reduce ministry interference or government interference in the running of sports bodies. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka cricket, from 1997 to now, a bulk of that period cricket has been administered by interim committees put by various ministers. Now, the danger of interim committees, they are not answerable to the stakeholders. They are only answerable to the minister. And the present situation of cricket in Sri Lanka, this is my personal opinion, is because for a bulk of the last 15 years, cricket has been run by interim committees. Now, we have to do away with that. The ministry should not be able to put office bearers or interim arrangements to run a sports body. But they must be able to regulate such bodies. Now, let's say, for example, if a sporting association gets ministry funding, the ministry is entitled to ensure that every rupee is spent in the manner it ought to be. Now, if somebody is found fault with or has mismanaged these funds, the answer is not to remove him and put the choice of the minister in to run the show. You must punish that individual and ensure that he has no place ever in the administration of that particular sport. His replacement must be elected or done by the stakeholders of the sporting body. So those are the three main areas. One is empowering the sports council. Two, ensuring stability for private sector participation. And three, ensuring that political interference is removed, but political regulation is allowed. And that line between interference and regulation has to be very, very clearly demarcated. And I think once you demarcate it, we will not get pressure from the international bodies also to amend the laws or amend our regulations to bring it in line with their laws. And, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of countries have world-class procedures in place. We just need to look at them and incorporate what is good for Sri Lanka and leave out what is not. So currently the Ministry of Sports is actually taking very active steps to amend the sports law and to ensure that Sri Lanka is right up there when it comes to governance in sports. So fingers crossed, hopefully we'll get there and get there soon.
A very comprehensive understanding there given to where we are heading with the new sports law and everything. Something I want to clarify is, now we have had a lot of people from the sports council, the new sports council, as you mentioned, a very capable sports council that is present. We've had them and we've had discussions with them, and something that has come to light is this thing known as a sports policy for the country. Now, I'm not sure if that element falls within the ambit of the sports law within the country, but how does that really affect how we carry out sports within the future? Is that also focusing on certain elements within the law that should be amended, one would say, or is that something completely irrelevant to how the law functions?
No, I think policy and the law should be different. And I think the policy should be the exclusive mandate of the Minister of Sports, because it is he who should have the complete, he can get advice of course, but the final decision on the sporting policy for Sri Lanka should rest with the minister. The implementation of that can be done by various entities. So, but going forward, even to amend the law, there has to be the vision and the mission of sports in Sri Lanka has to be set out as a policy document. And I think the current minister has that, and he has emphasized it on many fronts, that it is his vision that sporting bodies should be autonomous, that as far as possible they should run with private sector funding and adopt a corporate structure in their governance. So I think we are headed in the right direction, and hopefully if we all the stakeholders get and work together in a very cohesive and positive manner, we can have a new act in place very soon, which will allow Sri Lanka to maximize its sporting talent. I mean, we have a lot of talent, and with our limited resources, I mean, you watched Olympics. In 2000, Susantika won a silver medal. I mean, when you watch the track and field athletes today, can you even imagine that one of our athletes achieved that? And we achieved that on talent. So there are so many other talented individuals in Sri Lanka. but it is our duty to make sure they have a protective legislative framework where they can concentrate on their talent and the rest will look after itself.
All right. A very short question before we move into our break. Mr. Marapana, thank you again for the time you have given us. You say that we are heading in that direction, and you mentioned that, okay, look, we need to talk about this commercialization aspect. When we talk about things like transparency and corruption, are they all tied into this? Can we see those things also getting mitigated as we go ahead in the event we consider that a certain amount of that would be present? Will we see that those elements will transparency issues pertaining to corruption will also be watered down if we take this approach forward?
No, because that's a very interesting question. If you look at Sri Lanka cricket, from 97 to now, elected bodies have been suspended by various sports ministers on the ground of corruption. But can you tell me, has any one such allegation ever been proved? And the simple answer is no. Mm-hmm. So this corruption word has been used by various ministries and ministers to remove elected bodies and put their own people in to run the show. After that, they forget about the charges. Until today, not one allegation of corruption in sports has ever been taken to court.
Okay.
So I don't think, this kind of large-scale corruption that people always talk about, if it's there, why don't we take it to court and find those people guilty?
True.
So we have the legal framework in place for corruption. And in today's digital social media age, it's very difficult to be not transparent because people get exposed very fast. Someone will take a screenshot or something and it will be on social media. So I am not worried. I am not worried that corruption in sports, lack of transparency in sports will hold back Sri Lanka going forward. Because those things will sort themselves out. And as we get more digital, as payments get digital, it's very difficult for bribery or corruption to take place.
True.
So I don't think that's going to be such a big issue as people make it out to be.
All right. Very comprehensive understanding given. The President's Counsel, Navin Marapana, he is part of the committee in charge of amending the sports law within this country and quite a huge portfolio. Thank you so much for giving us this time and joining us on this discussion, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Sports have a unique ability to bring people together. It is our responsibility as a nation to make sure the best in each field gets a shot at their dreams so they can bring glory to this country. But in the past, accusations were raised against the actual process of bringing athletes to the national levels without letting them fall through the cracks. Professor Timothy Davis, a veteran scholar in the field of sporting legislature and anti-doping and an author in sporting regulations worldwide, wrote in his paper, "What is Sports Law? The evolutionary capability within this specific field of law." In reference to the paper published within the Market Sports Law Review, he states, "I asked if the question regarding sports law character as a separate discipline is merely a matter of academic curiosity. No doubt, some will say the debate is only relevant to academics. Such a conclusion, however, may be too myopic. As alluded to above, such an attitude fails to recognize that the development of sports law can be viewed as evidence of the transformation of relationships in the sports context. An important thought when assessing the future of sports law both nationally and abroad." That is all from us here at Law, Land and Liberty. Join us again next week as we bring to you another legal topic and break it down. I'm Danidhu Tanwasam. Have a great night.